Three, two, one. All right, all right. Another old school Sunday Conversations. I'm blessed to have Brother Rodney Dawson in the building. I don't want to get your title wrong, Rodney, but I know that you are, I think, over the education department over at the Greensboro Museum. Is that correct?
That's it. They call it basically a manager, but we call it curator of education. And it's the Greensboro History Museum.
Good deal. Curator of Education, the Greensboro Museum. Thank you for being with us today. Again, Old School Sunday Conversations, where we have an opportunity to sit with interesting people, also learn about things that just help make our lives better, things that we may not know that is an opportunity for us to grow in knowledge. So just want to sit and have a conversation with you on what you do at the Greensboro Museum. And if you can, again, give a little bit of your background and enlighten us to why museums are important in our communities.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I always tell folks, I never thought I'd work at a museum.
Okay.
But life found me there. I never found myself doing quite all the things that I've done. I never really envisioned. I never wrote it out. And but started out, grew up in High Point, North Carolina. Ended up going to college for a short spell on a track scholarship. I was fast and good at track, but wasn't that great in the classroom. It wasn't a matter of intelligence. I just didn't apply myself, and ended up coming home. Well, didn't want to come home, so I joined the military, and so I served in the United States Army. Went overseas, got a combat patch, served in different places stateside. Dating myself, I was in the Persian Gulf War, so way back then. So to this day, I don't like heat. I was just telling you off mic, my AC went out. But over in Iraq, we used to get 130-degree temperature, and ever since then, I can't deal with extreme heat. So I don't even want to go home right now.
I hear you. Hey, I appreciate your service and hope that AC get taken care of.
It will. It will indeed. But so after the military, I worked in radio for quite some time here locally. When we started out, it was a privately owned a radio group. It was just a gospel station. And then 97.1 WQMG was owned by the Pogues. They ended up selling it to Sinclair, and Sinclair Broadcasting sold it to its current owner, Intercom, and it's a conglomerate here, and they do very well. They have 102 Jams, WJMH, WQMG. They have 93 The Wolf, which was oldies 93 when I was there, and got a couple other stations. But 97.1 has done very well. It's considered one of the top stations in the market, particularly in the Southeast. 102 Jams at one time was a top 10, may still be considered one of the top 10 urban hip hop stations in the country. And so got a lot of experience there, learning how to talk in front of people and event planning, putting things together, and then telling stories, really, or, having a platform to share people's stories, and speeding up the process of word of mouth, which is all radio is. And all this stuff would serve me in my job today, But during the recession in 2008, one of the first industries to take a hit was radio, because advertisers, radios are funded by ad dollars from businesses. And the first thing they cut was their ad budget. And so the station I was working for was changing formats. And so for me, it meant basically going out of business. It was, it's not a format I wanted to do. And I was looking for a job. And so I had done a lot of stuff in the community, and a friend of mine called. She was an assistant principal, and she called and said, "Hey, we got a position we need to fill. We know a lot of people. We're having a problem filling it. Can you suggest some names?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Me," and raised my hand. Right on. So that's what got me into education, and I worked as a behavioral support liaison, and I had a few schools that I traveled to, but primarily one. And I worked with exceptional children that were having behavioral issues, where they were having a hard time staying in the classrooms. And I remember once, and I tell this story, my principal came to me. She said, "Hey, I need to get a grant. Can you help me write this? I'm gonna write this grant. I need you to put in a bit about it so I can get some iPads for your program. So I said, okay. And I wrote like a page and a half, thinking I was just gonna get an iPad for myself, you know.
Yeah, right.
I wrote a page and a half. She looked at it, she said, this is good. She said, change the number, put like 40 on there. I said, okay. And I changed it and we got it. And so I not only got an iPad, and I've always been into gadgets. I not only got an iPad for myself, but I had some for my students. And I would give them assignments. And the teacher was supposed to, the classroom teacher was supposed to give them assignments, but it never worked out that way. So I had to come up with my own assignments. And I would walk in there. They already didn't want to be in there because it's essentially like being in school suspension or something. And I would say, I want you to do this, and I want you to break it up into 3 parts. And I would hear, oh, Mr. Dawson, I don't want to do that. But when I pulled out that iPad, I had them at hello. They were like, yeah, we'll do it. I said, right. You know, these kids are like me. I said, you know, technology seems to stimulate them. It seems to excite them. They get engaged. And I said, I wonder if there's a degree for this. Lo and behold, I found out there was. Even A&T offered one. So I got me a master's in instructional technology at North Carolina A&T, and it was just using technology to teach. Most people, when I was in the school system, they heard technology. They thought I was informational technology, what we call IT. So that just, I need to fix everything. So if the smart board breaks down or the internet goes down or something's not connected right, they would call me. And I had a hard time trying to explain, no, that's not what I do. I use technology. It's instructional technology. I use technology to teach. I'm not here to, you know, when Power School goes down or get the internet back up, they weren't trying to hear it, or your projector's not working. So I had to learn how to do it. And I remember one of my custodians taught me how to install a projector. Got a grant. We got a bunch of projectors. I said, it was fun. And I told my principal, I said, let me install. So took a teacher work day. I spent that whole day putting brand new projectors in to the classrooms that needed it. And just getting that look. You didn't ask me all this, but just seeing the look on the teacher's face when you walk in and she's got a brighter screen because I changed the bulb, or she's got a brand new projector up there, or he has the use of an active table or a smart board or something like that, you know, and that excited me. So I just kept pursuing it, and later went on and got a education specialist degree in educational leadership, and soon to have my doctorate in the same field in educational leadership. But I left the classroom in 2018 because of the long hours, and just mentally drained. I wasn't trying to study when I got home, and I found out about this job where I could stay in education, and I've always had a love for history. And so in the fall of 2018, I became the curator of education at the Greensboro History Museum. And so one of the things I do, I work with veterans. We do programs called Living History, where we hire actors and actresses to come in and portray different people that are from this area for Veterans Day, Black History Month, and we do it for Women's History Month, and we're going to do it again in July for something else. But it calls me to work with the Veterans Parade Committee, with the disabled veterans. I'm not a disabled veteran, but I work with them for a parade committee that we put on every year. And so because of my veteran status and ability to relate, that Army played a major part in my Army experience played a major part in what I do here. My work with instructional technology. I do a lot of videos on YouTube, and I send them to our K-12 schools and to our colleges, but it's just trying to find an engaging way to learn, or for teachers to have something that's technology enriched to supplement a lesson plan or build a lesson plan around. Now, time in radio. I do a lot of public speaking. You know, I just was at Appalachian State a couple of weeks ago. They had me go speak to their faculty. And so from my time in radio, learning the skills to present and using different platforms to keep people engaged, and so they can retain the information and have it somewhat entertaining. So, God, they say God works in mysterious ways, but I used to jump from job field to job field thinking like, oh, I wasn't successful, but he was just setting me up. And so everything I've done in the past, I've been able to bring it together and utilize this job here.
Glory to God. And I love the way that you brought that together. And I definitely appreciate you sharing that with our community. It definitely may help someone who's looking for encouragement to know that, hey, sometimes, like you said, in 2008, you're looking at a bad thing happening, and then having that opportunity that turned into an opportunity by being able to utilize your network.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely a blessing. And, I was blessed enough when you were out there representing for the Greensboro History Museum, where my career changed. I just was coming out of an accident, and my wife was like, you need to go talk to that brother over there who's sharing some information about the Greensboro History Museum. And we struck up a conversation, and I'm blessed to say that we've been talking ever since. And you got me my first job into education by, again, as you said, leveraging the relationship, leveraging network, and finding out a little bit about my background. I was able to get my start back in education. Shout out to Gate City Charter Academy, and that was a blessing for me. So, I thank God for you, and thank God that He works in these awesome ways. And I'm hoping, again, through these old school Sunday conversations, that people hear information that can help them grow, things that they may not know about, and not know even that they have access to, and the ability to grow within that space. But again, getting back to that thought of the importance of museums and being in the community, I guess gave an example of how important and how expansive, again, just how that network is. You guys sharing information about the history of Greensboro, and me having the opportunity to engage with you, talk to you, find out more about the history of Greensboro. And then just even within talking and networking, having that opportunity to, in that case, it definitely saved my life, because I couldn't do my job anymore based on the accident that I was in. But what are some of the ways that the museum engages with the community, and the importance of a history museum, and why people should pay attention to their history? I know there's a famous quote, my most adored quote from Malcolm X. History is a people's memory, and without a memory, man is demoted to the lower animal. But how do you look at history in keeping the community engaged, and us not falling off and becoming that lower animal?
Well, and I'm glad you said that. But history is it's a story. And one of the things I found, even though I'm the curator of education, I work primarily with educational institutions, mainly K-12 and then our colleges. But my job is to help share stories. It's not always to tell a story. Sometimes I do that, but it's to help share a story, give a platform to share a story.
Okay.
And much of the story that we're told has been his story. I'm working on a podcast now. I got my intern assigned to working on a podcast. We did a webinar series called Minding Our Monuments.
All right.
Met a lady who lives in California, whose her ancestor was an enslaver. The city of Winston-Salem is named after this person, and he had several statues at Guilford National Courthouse, Guilford Park National, Guilford County Guilford Courthouse National Park. He has a statue there. He has his name is on a scroll at the University of Chapel Hill. It's just a lot of great achievements. But he was an enslaver, right. And she grew up being very proud of this connection with him. And when she found out that he was an enslaver, she went on a mission. She ended up connecting with me. We did a podcast together a couple years ago. She ended up writing op-eds for the News and Records, and we got to talking. I said, let's just do this webinar series. And then we brought in a gentleman from A&T who spoke. We brought in this organization called Monument Lab out of Philadelphia. We found out there are several hundreds of African Americans that fought in the Revolutionary War, and we were able to pull together some of the descendants. And we had a series where we talked to them. And then we also spoke with this gentleman named Trevor Freeman, who's over the Western North Carolina Historical, I might be butchering the name, but Western North Carolina Historical Society. He's the public affairs coordinator. He did his thesis on African-American soldiers and the patriots in the Revolutionary War. And we talked to an author named John Reese, who's written several books about it. But we decided to turn it into a podcast. And I got this really, really talented intern who's she could do anything. She could be in radio. She loves history. She could be an historian. She could be a journalist. She's going to law school after she finishes NC State. And I said, I want to make this your project. And she just sent me a draft of it. And in the draft, she breaks down what the word remembrance is, and that's an action word, and it ties into that his story. You know, you go into many museums across the country, and it's just telling the story from one perspective. You know, and people have to have a sense of belonging when they walk into a place. They got to feel like they belong. So, in other words, they got to hear some music that sounds like some music they grew up with, or they got to be able to look on the walls and see someone that looks like them. You know, or something that they can relate to, that they can connect to, needs to be reflected in that museum. And if it's not, then they don't think that's their museum. And so many museums, if you're a person of color, you're going to walk in, you may see yourself or your image, but it's going to be marginalized in a way. For African Americans, it's civil rights and enslavement. And while those are some accomplishments that we overcame, that's not all we are. You know, we want to get to the point where a Black person is in a museum just for making a chair. You know, so we don't have to go through trauma to get noted in a museum. You know, same for our LGBTQIA, same for our Latinx community, our Native Americans. And so museums want to reflect the society that they serve. And what you see in the museum is what you deem important. You know, they must have done something if they're in the museum. They must be successful. They must be upstanding. They must have made a mark. And so if all the folks that you see in the museum only represent one demographic, or a slim number of demographics, then what does that say about the people that are not depicted? You know, and so a museum's job is to, when you walk in, is to reflect the society that it serves, number one. And two, it should share and tell their stories of all the people that it serves in that society. You know, and then museums, my boss often says, if you walk in a museum every time, if you come in this museum, and you've been in our museum, if you walk in this museum 10 times and 10 times you walk out and you're smiling, the museum didn't do its job. There needs to be some story in there. And when you walk out, you're a little upset, or you're a little sad, or you're a little confused, and you want to learn more. But if you're happy all the time, it's not telling the full story. And so it's just a museum's job is to inform people this is our story, because what you think back then determines what you think today and what you will think tomorrow. You know,
I like that. I like how you tie that to remembrance as well, and the importance of contributions, as you say, more than just trauma, the significance of all the contributions that have participated in what defines our history. And I can see that that acknowledgement that needs to be made by a lot of people that, as you may say, that may not make that acknowledgement. You know, they go in and see one side of the story and just happy with that one side, and not being able to recognize all of those participants that made things what they were. And as you said, reflecting back on those histories, it definitely frames where their mindset is at today. If they had that kind of a dismissive reality of other people's contributions to what has made our society what it is today. So I appreciate you sharing that.
And museums are turning. There's a lot of workshops and stuff I go to where they're trying to get away from that paternalistic view or that colonialistic view and include more stories. But this was renewed in my mind because I was listening to that draft that my intern did, and she pulled together the people that are in her circle, and they're all college students. And she was relating how they see themselves in media and how they see themselves in monuments. And then how do they see the folks that are depicted in these monuments that are seen in these museums? What is that saying about them? And it was a wide group of people. She had a female from South Asian heritage, to a young white lady, to African-American. She even had one lady say, I'm African-American plus size, how I don't see myself represented, and how she, just different ways people need to see themselves. And that's what a museum, you get a sense of belonging of where you are, who you are, and that's depicted usually in a museum of some sort. It's depicted in the digital spaces too, like social media, television, things like that. But the museum tells you, do you belong? And so if you don't see yourself reflected in that museum, I can walk into the I always mess up the official name, but the was it the National African American Heritage Museum in Washington, D.C., the one that just went up not too long ago.
Yes, yes.
And went there. I spent 4 hours there, didn't make it off. I think I made it to 2 floors. They told me to make 4 trips. Line was around the building to get in.
Wow.
But when I walked in there, I felt like, oh, I belong here. That's why I spent 4 hours.
Exactly.
You know, if I didn't see myself in that museum, I'm not going to spend 4 hours. You know, so I tell folks, if you're trying to target LGBT, if you're trying to target any demographic of folks, and if they're not coming, might be they don't feel like they belong there. And then how do you make them get them to the point that they belong there? You can't all of a sudden do a program. So I'm going to do a program for Latinx. Now you should feel like you should belong. You have to go out and garner and create relationships with that group. Maybe not just go out and talk to them and meet them. And maybe 2 years down the road or a year and a half down the road, hey, what are your ideas on doing a program on this? Then, you know, later on, what are your ideas on doing an exhibit on this? But let them lead it. You know, your job is to create the platform so that they can tell that story. And you have the expertise to show them how. But it's important, you know, it's really important because it's how you see yourself. And another thing I was reminded of by the work that my intern did, Alondia Warren is her name. She reminded me is you can't teach what you don't know.
Okay.
You know, and there's a lot of history out there that we just do not know. And so therefore we do not know to teach. And there's a reason we don't know it. Carter G. Woodson wrote the book, Miseducation of a Negro. And he said, I'm an authority on that because I have a doctorate. I'm about to get my doctorate. So I'm the most miseducated, you know, but you got to find out your own history. Talk to your elders, you know, talk to Paul, talk to that deacon at the church before they leave this earth. I got an interview I did with Reverend Jackson. On a whim, I reached out to him. Jesse Jackson, he called me back. We did an interview. He came to the museum to see me. I was out of town, but he came to the museum to check me out. You know,
that's awesome.
But talk to these folks before they leave this earth and get this history. And so you can find out because it's intentionally not in books. It's intentionally not up. So you have to learn it yourself. You know, I mean, it's mind-boggling. Did you know that African Americans started country music?
No, I have learned that recently. I've been paying attention to some of the in class with cars, and definitely a lot of history has been revealed.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing that as you've been pointing out the power of remembrance, and it seems that again, if you're going for a doctorate degree and then you're finding out all of this stuff that you don't know, I'm working on my second master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is still opening up to a lot of things that I don't know, and as you said, these conversations. And I think that's a lot of that is born out of the old school Sunday conversations, having the opportunity to talk to people and learn as much as we can within this space, and have that opportunity to reach out to people who are knowledgeable and who can share that information so that we don't walk around not knowing and not acknowledging what some people's contributions have been. So
and then pass along. Yeah. And like, boy, I told you. You picked the wrong person to talk to. You picked a guy who used to work in radio, and I used to teach, so you know I talk a
lot. No problem. I appreciate that.
But you know, I belong to a fraternity. You can see it in the back, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Yes. Just studying the history of Kappa Alpha Psi and how these Black Greek letter organizations started and what differs them from other organizations. But they were there to help the next guy or the next lady come along. But in that, it's allowed me the opportunity to get with what I call some really major players in Greensboro when it relates to history. And it's not just African Americans. I'm jumping from topic to topic, but I'm working on a podcast called Holocaust Education. We did a webinar a little over almost 2 years ago called Holocaust Education in 3 parts. But there's going to be a monument that's going to go up. COVID slowed it down. It's either going to be this year or next year, called She Wouldn't Take Off Her Boots. but it's under Women of the Shoah, but it's commemorating the women that were lost during the Holocaust. An artist named Victoria Milstein, who owns a studio downtown, she's spearheading that effort. But in that studies and working, I befriended her, and she's invited me to her home. My wife, my family, we went over there for Seder earlier this year, and just learning about the Jewish contribution to the city of Greensboro, 1898, Moses and Caesar Cone, and all this stuff.
Yeah, can you real quick? I'm sorry for interrupting. What is Seder? I'm not familiar with that term. What does Seder mean?
It's a dinner. It's a ritualistic dinner that's done for Passover. I think it's either 2 nights before Passover. And so my first one was recently, and we went, and I just learned. I just learned about the more about the culture and the practice, and I learned about the contributions and the families that have come through the Gate City. And why they've been so successful. So I'm just finishing up the podcast. I don't know when we're going to release it, but I'm pretty proud of it. But I got a part 1 and a part 2 of Holocaust education. But I couldn't tell that story because I'm not Jewish. So I can't say, every Friday I went to Sabbath, growing up. No, I can't say that, So I said, I need to find the community members that can, and I'm going to talk myself out of the point. But my point is, being around different people, you learn so much. Being around Kappa Alpha Psi, I learned what somebody called the real A&T 4, or the real Greensboro 4. That was Dr. Mel Blunt, who was named in one of the suits that it was Simpkins, Dr. Simpkins, when he sued Moses Cone Hospital, and won the suit in 1963. But that suit, it was Dr. Simpkins led it, but he had about 8 other medical practitioners, including Dr. Dr. Blunt. And in that suit, it set the precedent to integrate hospitals nationwide.
Okay.
Now, how come I didn't learn that in school? Nationwide, And so then they talked about Kenneth Lee, who was one of the first graduates of law school at Chapel Hill. Okay. And then they had Dr. Mel Swan. Mel Swan, he was an educator. He was a longtime football announcer for A&T football, called over 40 years worth of games, he and Spencer Gwynn. And so for over 40 years, they called the game. He since passed. My daughter's old middle school is named after him, Swan Middle School. Okay. And then the fourth was Justice Henry Fry, who's the first African-American Supreme Court justice in the state of North Carolina. All of these are Kappa men, right? Awesome. So me studying that history, learned about this strong connection in Greensboro. Me studying about the Jewish contribution helped solidify how Greensboro is a beacon of social justice. Things happen here that didn't happen other places. The system was pushed here unlike it did in other places. Education played a major role in why this city was pushed to the way it was, and that's due to the Quaker influence. When the Quakers settled here and how they started the first schools, and it was like the model, the blueprint to start the schools from the Quakers. Business was brought here, and merchantry by the Scots-Irish. So all these things came together. African Americans played a major role in education and architecture. All right, but all these things came together. I'll say this, then I'll shut up for real. But the root word of education is educere, E-D-U-C-E-R-E, which means to lead someone out, lead them to their fullest potential. So, teaching, my goal was always not to make it student-centered or teacher-centered, where the teacher's sitting there lecturing for 45 minutes and you got to try to remember. That's the old school way. Or student-centered. You want to make it learning-centered. And so where learning kind of dictates what goes on. And so if you're leading someone, educere, if you mess around and say, Greensboro was big, they're like, we want to be sophisticated. We want to attract all these different companies to come here so we can be sophisticated and make money and get all these folks to come here. At one time, we were the denim capital of the world. We were close to being one of the insurance capitals here. But Greensboro wanted to be different. They wanted to be quiet and trouble-free. And they said education is a way to do that. That's from that Quaker influence. So they outbid Charlotte Mecklenburg and outbid the Raleigh Triangle area and promised some money and gave up some land to get North Carolina Agriculture and Mechanical School for the colored to come here, later to become North Carolina A&T, right? And so, and we had the Jewish contribution from Moses and Caesar Cone that brought the Cone Mills here, and they had the 5 mill plants, and they had mill villages. And so people could come here. They had the Great Migration where people would go to the north or to the west or to the Midwest. Well, a lot of them stopped here because they knew they could get a job. May not be as paid as well as their white counterparts, but they would come here because they knew they could get a job. Folks that were not of color would come here because they knew they could get a job. African Americans knew they had a couple elementary schools they could come. That would have not always the case. We didn't always have a high school here, especially for blacks. We didn't get our first high school until 1929, high school. So people knew they could come here. And we had colleges, Bennett College. You know, we had Women's College, which was later UNCG. We had North Carolina A&T. You could live here and go to Winston-Salem State, different schools. And so we developed a middle class here because of redlining. If you were middle class or upper middle class to the lower socioeconomic, you still had to live in the same neighborhood. You know, right. It's just the one that had money, their yard might be kept up a little bit better because they could afford it as the other one. You have, you know, you grow up in those neighborhoods, you're like the so-and-so house on the corner always keep the nice yard. You know, they always got the latest stuff. We were forced to live in the same area because of redlining. We couldn't move anywhere we wanted to. But it caused that network of people to work together, and they, with all these schools coming here, they messed around and started doing some educare, leading people out to their fullest potential. And so folks would come here and they would say, this Jim Crow policy we got going on, it ain't right. And they would push the envelope. You know, the way that certain jobs are restricted to women or other folks, it ain't right. You had allies, people like Ben Smith, who was a, you know, we merged, I think they merged in 94, 96, but it used to be High Point City Schools, Greensboro City Schools, and then Guilford County Schools. And then in 94, 96, somewhere around there, they all three merged in this Guilford County Schools. But when it was Greensboro City Schools by itself, a guy named Ben L. Smith, whom Smith High School was named after, who was a religious man, a man of the faith, came here and said, there's not a lot of educare going on here. People aren't being let out to their fullest potential. I see a lot of marginalization. I see a lot of segregation, you know, so he started doing little things to push the envelope. You know, educare does that to a person. I want people to live and be let out to their fullest potential, you know, and so that's what set Greensboro apart a little bit from other places. I'm not saying they set out to do this, but you know, you got plans and then God has his plans. But what I am saying is that knowing that history, you can come to the museum and read a little bit of that, but a lot of that comes from you learning on your own. And I learned two things. One of the smartest man I've ever met never finished high school. He used to have these big, strong hands. You know, he didn't work out. He was a solid guy and had these big hands, and his hand used to engulf my hand. And I used to sit down and talk to him. It was my Uncle Worth. He's since passed. But I would sit and talk to my Uncle Worth. And he was just always quiet. I know he went through stuff. I found out later in life, all the things he went through. Kept him a pretty lady, but it was a one-man woman. What do you call it? One-woman man. One-man woman, you know. But he always had him a nice one, you know what I'm saying? Right. Nice. And so, and I would say, Uncle Worth, you know, how come you even killed? You never get high, you never get low. And they call me Jamal. My name is Rodney Jamal. And he say, Maul, he say, I found that, you know, I try not to let things bother me. You know, and he didn't say this, but he was saying, I know whom I serve. Okay. You know, I'm not gonna let things bother me too much. You know, I'm gonna stay right here. Y'all can go crazy, y'all can get high, y'all can get low. I'm gonna stay right here. I took that to heart, you know, and I've tried to be that way myself. And then I befriended Chief Justice Henry Fry because of documentary I'm working on. And then turns out, you know, he's in the same fraternity as I. His wife is in the same sorority as my mom. And they kind of took us in, as what I'm hearing they tend to do. They took us in and kind of adopted us, awesome. And, you know, and snuggled us. And so I was having lunch with him. Maybe it's been a month and a half ago. And we were having lunch. And you could, if you're not familiar with him, look him up. But remarkable man, major achievements. I mean, major achievements. First African-American Supreme Court justice. He was an assistant district attorney in the 1960s. You know, awesome. African-American male. J. Kenneth Lee is the one that talked him into going to law school. He's from Ellerbe, North Carolina. grew up on a farm, that kind of stuff. His wife has done tremendous things. She has a YWCA named after her on Wendover in Greensboro. And the things she's done with the United Way, just humble. They don't tell you this. All this stuff I read about, they never sat down and said, this is what we did. This is because I started studying and reading. That's the only reason I know it. But I was having lunch with him, and I said, I've never seen him upset. And I said, let me ask you, I said, has anyone outside of your family ever seen you upset? And he said, no. He said, I try not to let things bother me. So here it is. I got my uncle, a man that I most admire, telling me the advice that he left me with is I try not to let things bother me. And then here's this man who has degrees up the wazoo, first African-American Supreme Court justice. I can spend an hour talking about his accomplishments, and the advice that he gave me is I try not to let things bother me.
Amen.
And so when you put that all together, how would I know this? I'm not going to read that in a book. I know this from conversing with these folks. So part of history won't be displayed on a wall, won't be in a text. Part of it you're going to learn from conversing and being around people. And then it's our job to put it in text or put it on the wall to the degree that we can.
Amen. Well, that's powerful. Edge of Seer. I'm going to, I always suggest and tell my my listener audience to go back and play it if they didn't pick some up. But this is one old school Sunday conversation. I'm gonna have to go back, push the play button, pull my pad out, write down some of these names, and as you say, sit in Edge of Seer, where I'm learning from all of this information that you shared, and having that ability to sit in conversation with you is definitely a blessing. So I definitely appreciate that, and appreciate you sharing with us and having that opportunity to learn more about, again, the importance of museums, the importance of history, and the importance of helping ourselves grow by being able to tap in and dig for the knowledge. As you said, it's one thing for somebody to tell you something, but it's another thing for you to go out there and do some of that research. And a lot of times that history, I like what you said. I think I heard that over the weekend with Dr. Carr, as well as being able to sit with elders and sit in community and having that ability to gain that history. And I love the fact that you're willing to share that platform to allow those truths to come out that may be hidden or not spoken of for a reason. And just speaking of that, I'm just going to do a quick follow-up question, because I know that you have a couple of things to tend to. One, getting that air back on and running like you needed to run. But can you talk a little bit on whether that history is purposely left out, where people don't display the best of everybody, or is that something deliberate, or is it something like, well, hey, we, like as you said, it's his story, so I'm going to try to make myself, we run everything, or in a sense what people would think from later days, definitely, hey, we run all of this, so we're going to have to perch ourselves as high as possible and make ourselves look the best. And, we're not going to put your history in there. But and where did it start, where kind of an awakening is taking place? As you were talking, I was thinking about all of those different merges that you talked about with the Quakers, the mindset of the Edge of Seer, where, again, Greensboro saying, hey, we're going to be unique. I thought about the term that I always see and wanted to unpack and been trying to learn about as I've been walking through Greensboro, being known as the Gateway City, being in Thomasville. Again, a lot of merchants came this way. They decided, hey, we're gonna have a train that runs to Greensboro, making sure that, again, they had a gateway to Greensboro, and kind of a gateway to the world on how they wanted to display themselves. And again, a lot of people, I was 39 years old when I had found out about Greensboro. So that was a place that was off my radar growing up in Detroit. And as you said, if you don't have anybody talking to you about it, or if you don't hear about it, for this history to be so rich and for me not to hear about it in the 39 young years of my life, it was pretty amazing. And again, just going back to that question, is that something deliberate where certain history is put in there, or is that something that you feel just has happened over time where certain history was not recognized?
As I said, let me type something up so I can remember to hit these points. That's why I was typing right quick. But I do a podcast called History Notes, and you can go on anywhere you get your podcast or go on our website, greensborohistory.org, and search for it. But I talked with Dr. Deborah Barnes. She's talking about lynching. As a matter of fact, we do a summer speaker series that got one coming up on the 20th. But on August 17th, Dr. Deborah Barnes is going to be, whose father was also one of she's an educational doctor, but her father was one of the plaintiffs in that suit against Moses Cone in 1963.
Okay.
But she talks about lynching, but she breaks down how narratives are spread. And so I would suggest that, for your listeners or viewers to go on History Notes and search for that. And you'll see a bunch of others too. But to answer your question, try to sum it all up, the railroad is what made Greensboro what it is. It's because we have that railroad. So the Cones knew they could come here and take the cotton straight from the fields and these denim and then put them on the railroads and get it to wherever they needed to get it to. And during World War II, we had a depot here. And, the Army and the Air Force used to be combined, just like the Navy and the Marine Corps. And so we had an it was for Air Force recruits, but it was an Army depot. And we processed airmen over 3,000 a week to go to the war front. And a lot of them stayed here, including a guy named Ralph Johns. He stayed here and opened up a clothing store. Ralph Johns was one of the encouragers of the A&T 4. He used to sell he was one of the few that would sell goods on East Greensboro, and a lot of the students from A&T would come there and buy their clothes and stuff like that. He allowed them to put on layaway, but he was one of the ones incentivizing them. Y'all need to go do whatever. Ralph Johns, he was his parents were Syrian heritage, but he was one that was pushing EduSeer. This ain't right. But he got introduced to Greensboro because of that Air Force depot. But that brought people here that ended up staying here, and then businesses came here because we were the gate city. It was between Atlanta and New York. People would come here and stop and stay and then just pass through. So we were the gateway. And Greensboro said, we want to keep those folks here. So how do we keep them? Well, let's get some jobs here. Let's get some schools here. That's for people to sustain and build a family around. But narratives, that's how the narrative is. In that podcast that I'm working on that we haven't released called Minding Our Monuments, Joanna Foley, the lady from California that help with this, she brought out a couple of slogans. I can't remember them exactly, but the person that owns the press tells the story, or the lion is the one that shares the deed or something. The people that tell the story shape the narrative.
Yes.
And then whatever happens needs to fit said narrative. So if something happens that does not fit that narrative, then it's not going to be told. So yes, some stories are intentionally left out. When you begin to intentionally leave out a story. So if I am at A&T and I have someone in my office from Central, but the majority of the people here are connected to A&T. Maybe not all of them go to A&T, but they've been influenced by A&T, or they got kids that go to A&T, or when you go to the store or Walmart, you see A&T gear hanging up everywhere. So A&T
Aggie pride,
and you're gonna hear that. Well, you can't see it, but you're gonna see that Aggie pride over there. And so A&T controls the narrative. So somebody from Central may come in like, hey, well, let me tell you about what happened to Central. You're like, yeah, all right, we'll give you a side page. We'll give you a little column. Go ahead and tell us about Central.
Right.
But the majority of what you're going to hear is about A&T. Then you're going to have some that are going to say, I don't want to hear anything about Central. They don't belong. I don't want to put up on the walls. I don't care. Make sure everything is A&T. Well, that's kind of where our society is, and that's kind of where our history has been shaped and formed, and that's where our narrative is. The narrative is predominantly white and male. And there's a certain image and a certain story that you want to tell. And so you don't want to talk about people having representation or people having a sense of belonging because that goes against the narrative. So you're not going to hear about Dr. George Simpkins. You're not going to hear about the lawsuit in 1963. You're not going to hear about how he integrated Gillespie Park Golf Course. You're not going to hear the full story about how Gillespie Park was one of the top courses in the Southeast. It was designed by the same guy who designed Augusta National, Perry Maxwell.
Right.
It was an 18-hole course. It's only 9 holes now because they destroyed 9 holes. Because they destroyed it because they didn't want to integrate. So they shut everything down. Every recreational facility in Greensboro was shut down. You're not going to hear that story.
Wow.
You know, and so because it goes against the narrative. I don't want people to see how these folks push the envelope. Otherwise, then somebody else might try and do it. Right. And then outside of intentionally leaving it out, it becomes customarily left out. You know, so I gave the example of if you're so used to everybody only talking about A&T, it becomes the custom to only talk about A&T. You may not set out to intentionally omit Central. It's just the thing that is done. It's custom. You know, so Central becomes marginalized. But that happens in our history today. The non-dominant groups become marginalized. And there's a gentleman named Osha Gray Davidson. He is also, we did a podcast with him over 2 years ago. He wrote a book called Best of Enemies. That book was turned into a movie starring Sam Rockwell and Taraji P. Henson. I suggest you look at it. It's a great movie. Taraji did an excellent job. She should have won a Grammy or something for it. But I talked to Osha Gray Davidson, and we interviewed him for my podcast. I had to moderate a program he did. The library brought him in. We hit it off. And we all went out to dinner afterwards. And he said, and he's a white gentleman, and he understood. He says, Rodney, there's no such thing, and I've heard this before, but whatever reason, it resonated when he told me. He said, there's no such thing as racist and not racist, not in America. You're either racist or anti-racist. And that's everyone, black included.
Right.
You know, I grew up with a certain level of self-hate. I was always told, scrub my knees, get the black off my knees.
Wow.
You know, I was always told so-and-so had curly, more Eurocentric hair, so that was good hair. Anyone that didn't have that, they didn't say it, but it had to be the opposite. If your hair looks Eurocentric and that's good hair, then the hair that doesn't look like that must be bad hair.
Right.
A certain level of self-hate. In society, the way it's customarily set up, you will naturally be inclined to do that, right? So you have to work to not have self-hate. You know?
Right.
So there's no in between. You're either racist or anti-racist. You're either racist or working not to be racist. Black, white, whomever. You know, so our history is the same. You have to make efforts to include other people's stories in your history. You have to go out and actively try and do that. So sometimes it's intentionally left out, and sometimes it's left out because no one's pushing the envelope, challenging folks to include other stories. And so you have to do it yourself.
Wow, that's phenomenal. You got me thinking of 2 things. I thought I was about to end this conversation, but if you got a moment, I wanted to ask 2 more questions because you gave a great, awesome analogous example of how society, again, forms that narrative. Everybody ends up getting caught up in that narrative and running with it. The example of giving AT&T or everybody running around with A&T, and you saw how I was able to scream off Aggie pride. I've only been down here about 7 years, but you think I'm A&T as well. Sometimes when I get around that circle, and it's kind of, hey, either A&T or what, even though it's Central State University for me when it comes to HBCUs, for God, for Central and for State always. But that mindset, and hey, where some people say, okay, Central State, you can come around a little bit, where other people was like, no, we don't want to deal with that at all. And you just become a side note when you're kind of in that whole circle. What happens as it seems like you're getting a lot more of the pushback and a lot more of the inclusiveness in history with the latest movement that's been taking place. I kind of pointed to the George Floyd death that felt like something snapped on people, again, as you say, either you're racist or anti-racist around the world. It's kind of that line was divided. Like, hold on, something is going way too far. Where now you do have more of a push to have as many people included as possible, but this thought that's going out as well. And what happened with those 10 people that died in Buffalo? They say this gentleman had wrote a manifesto, and he started talking about this replacement theory, where you have Europeans or older Europeans. I know I can't speak for all of them, and I know he don't represent all of them, but there's this mindset of a replacement going on. And then I heard this great author, the Stephen King writer. He has a lot of people writing for him as well, but he was saying, that there needs to be more authors that are recognized. When you look at the top 145 authors, I think the story said, the top 130 some are older white men. So what is he talking about? But there's this sense and this fear that, hey, they starting to want to be included. Going back to that analogy again of the two colleges, Central is starting to edge our seat, like, hey, we should be learning about everybody. We in the building too. How come you don't want us to have any type of word or say? What happens with that pushback? Or do you think that there is a sense of that pushback in history where it's like, no, we just want to keep the narrative like this, Rodney? I don't know why you're trying to include all of this other history. We know that happened, but couldn't we just put that over in the corner of the museum? Why do we have to have this big display or this webinar? Is there a pushback against recognizing that history in the museum community?
Well, I think, certainly after George Floyd, there was a reckoning. People are starting to realize, okay, we've got a lot of miseducation going on, or we need to start making something right. We need to start correcting this. This is wrong. We've been going down this path, and we put our blinders on. And I could go so many places with this, but Dr. King talked about mistaking quiet for peacefulness, or quiet for peace. And that you think because it's quiet, that means there's peace. And you would much rather have things quiet. So there's still trouble. There's still something amiss. There's still something wrong. It's just that it's not being proclaimed. It's not in your face. People are they're being okay with it.
Right.
So go to any neighborhood and you'll find the lower socioeconomic part of the neighborhood. Let's take Greensboro, for instance. You can go to certain parts of East Greensboro, and you're going to find not as much money. You're going to find that the streets aren't kept up. Maybe the grass is a little overgrown. The roads need fixing, things of that nature. But when you go to Northwest or North or West Greensboro, you're going to find that the lawns are maintained. The streets are kept up. Most of your shopping centers are there. You're going to have a plethora of grocery stores. And you're going to have a plethora of doctors and doctors' offices and dentist offices and things of that nature. All right. And then you might be inclined to go to that neighborhood, and you can find the same story in any neighborhood, in High Point, in Winston, in Baltimore, in DC, you name it. And you'll go there and you'll think, oh, it must be that most poor people don't take care of their property. Or it must be that most Black people don't take care of their property. Or they don't like living in nice houses and things of that nature. But as I said in this podcast I'm working on, nothing just happened. Something always preceded it.
All right.
You could look at redlining. And if you study it, and we did a program on it, it will explain in great detail why Black people live mostly in East Greensboro. You can look at redlining and urban renewal and explain why there are no grocery stores in East Greensboro today. Probably can count on one hand how many. You can explain in Buffalo, New York, why it became a food desert when that supermarket shut down.
Wow.
Because there was no other fresh produce store, to the point where they had to take the food and put it outside and give it to them on the street because that community wouldn't eat. And so the only time when you have something like that and you don't have fresh produce, you got to go to Bojangles. I don't know if they got a Bojangles in Buffalo, but you got to go to a fast food. What does that do to your health? Where's the doctor's office? You're forced to go somewhere else because urban renewal usually push them out. But we'll get into a big conversation, but it's intentionally done. And so why, then you have to ask yourself, why were things done that way? There was a community, a city manager in New York in the early 1900s that realized that people used to travel to Coney Island. They used to like to go to the beach to vacation or just to have some leisurely activity. And most African Americans at the time, you couldn't buy a car. They couldn't even get it insured, if they did own a car. So they had to take the bus. He built the bridges. He had the bridges lowered when they built them. He had them constructed where they were only so high that it was unsafe for a bus to travel through.
Wow.
He intentionally did that so that African Americans couldn't get on the bus and travel to the beach, and the beaches would remain segregated. All right. That's what you call institutionalized racism. That's what you call structured racism. It was built into the structure. And so why is that? Why would people intentionally do that? I could go all day about the Better Homes America and how the state, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, how the state supported and built redlining, designed to keep neighborhoods segregated. In the South, they had redlining, but they had Jim Crow policies. In the North, they didn't have Jim Crow policies. So they said, how can we keep them segregated? They use redlining. Okay. These are, and so why is that? And you can trace that all the way back to 1600s. You can trace that all the way back to enslavement. If you really want to talk, you can then trace all of that to the Bible. Because I used to say, why does this stuff happen? And then God used a friend to tell me, and he says, you wrestle, I'm going to butcher the scripture, but you wrestle not against flesh and bones, but against principalities and spiritual wickedness in high places.
Amen.
So all this stuff that you have, you can see it. You see the manifestation, but you wrestling not against the flesh and bones, the structuralized racism that you see, and the people calling you the N-word and all that. That's not what you're wrestling against. You're wrestling against something higher than that. And for that, you need me to fight. All right. And so there's a reason why people want a narrative of minorities being marginalized, and they don't want them to matter. And you can trace that back to another scripture, the love of money. Not money, but the root of evil is the love of money. All right. So you can trace that back. Money was to be made by using African Americans as enslaved. Really quick, can I take, man, I'm late. Can I take 2 minutes? When in the 1600s, they had a rebellion called the Bacon Rebellion in 1676. I might be off a year or two. But the poor folks basically bound together and they went up against the elite. So it was the Native Americans, the poor whites, and you were pretty much known by where you were from. You went, race was a social, became a social construct, but you were known as the African, the Polish, the Native American. You were known by where you were from. Race was a social construct, wasn't really a thing. When they rebelled against the elite, and the elite they quelled it, and they said, we can't have this happen again. And so they decided we're going to divide people up based on race. All right. And that's when race really became a construct. It was used to divide people up. And then they tried to enslave certain groups, and people resisted, including African Americans. But you never hear that story. You always hear like, oh, we were just happy to be slaves, become enslaved. But no, we rebelled. It goes against the narrative. And so, but we were far removed from home, and money was to be made. So they would take the free labor and they would grow these crops. They would send these crops over to Europe. Europe would take these crops and these goods and turn them into garments and sell them to Asia. And everybody was making money. So they said, we can't stop enslavement because then we're going to have to charge Europe more money. And Europe said, we're going to have to charge Asia more money. So we're going to have to keep this thing going. And then people would come around, missionaries at the time would come around and say, we need to stop the slavery thing. It's hurting our witness. One day we're going to try to testify and tell people about Jesus. And they're going to say, but you own slaves. But we need to stop. We're going to lose our soul. People used to say that. And they're like, nope. Plantation owners would go to the church, say, I'm giving money to support this church. You want that money to keep coming? Don't anti-slavery stuff. And so it kept being perpetuated. Now, after slavery, and then the world started to the world court outlawed slavery, and they started pushing the United States to outlaw slavery. After the end of slavery, they said, we still need that labor. We still need to make this money. So they came up with the 13th Amendment. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it says enslavement is only tolerated except for a punishment of a crime. Also watch the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It breaks it down too. Wonderful project. Just check that out. But they said, if you're locked up, if you commit a crime, then we could use you. And they came up with convict leasing. And so when you commit a crime, I can now use you to perform these jobs. And so if you notice in a lot of these towns, when it came time for harvest these crops, the arrest rate went up, particularly for African Americans. They would walk in the streets and arrest you. They would pin a crime on you. Oh, we saw you stealing. No, I wasn't stealing. I was just out here chilling. Three or more, if you're three or more gathered, you would get loitering. You had to prove that you were gainfully employed. If you couldn't prove it, you would get a fine, which would lead you to jail. You know, and so then they started saying, well, how are we going to justify locking all these people up? You know, because before, while they were enslaved, if you took a poll on black folks, they would say they were loyal and hardworking. But after this, they started saying, no, they're shiftless and they're lazy and they're criminalistic. They said they got to criminalize black life to justify jailing them. So how you look,
the narrative.
Yeah. So we got to change the narrative to justify that it's not me being bad, it's you.
Right.
Bad. And it's how you carry yourself, it's how you look. You're criminal by nature. That justifies me locking you up and using you as labor. The state of Mississippi, 50% of their revenue was on convict leasing. Well, companies, railroads and stuff, these highways that were built, the Chapel Hill, all that stuff was built by slaves. The Washington Monument was built by enslaved. The other was built by convicts. All that was used. Look it up. Go look at convict leasing today and look at all the companies that played a part. The 13 by Ava DuVernay. Watch that documentary. Bed Bath & Beyond, Idaho Potatoes, Boeing, Belks, you name it. All of them use Walmart. All of them use convict leasing.
Wow, right.
For the love of money. It's the same thing that happened during enslavement. It's that money that keeps it going. But we got to keep the narrative that, and if you want someone to always think they're a slave, you can't make them think they can do anything else. You can't give them examples that they can do anything else. So the narrative has to always be that you cannot do. You're always supposed to be marginalized. You're always supposed to be minimalized. And so these histories that come up and these stories that come up, we don't want to project that. Now, I'm not saying everybody's making a conscious effort to do that, but I'm saying that's what has been done, you know? And so that answers the question of, is it deliberate? It can be deliberate, and it's also can be customary. You just become used to doing it.
Amen. Hey, I think you put a cap on this whole conversation and taking it back to the good book and ending that old school Sunday conversation from the word. I guess one more question that's coming up in my mind with us seeing those customs break. Do you see history and museums as a bridge to some of that breakage with the webinars that you've been doing, with getting people more involved with learning about their history? Do you see some of these customs breaking?
Absolutely. And there's some good people, white, black, Latinx, indigenous. There's some good people that are doing what they can to change it. You know, they may not know all the history, and some of them do. But I don't want to make it all doom and gloom and that, you know, all of one group of people are bad and all that. But there's some people that recognize that there's some misconceptions that have been taught. There's some false narratives that are being pushed out there. And they understand that it's incumbent upon museums and libraries to help set the foreground for generations to come to change this. And so they're doing a lot of things, trying to be more inclusive and trying to recognize histories. I'm involved in a cohort now with the Smithsonian and there's 9 other museums. And our job is to foster critical conversations. And one of the things they push us to do is say, if you're going to do a program, go out and establish a relationship with that community that's not sufficiently represented in your museum. And don't go to them and say, I want to do a program. That's why I want to talk to you. No, go to them and say, let's develop a relationship. And then when we're comfortable, we can start a program. And when you give them the program, are you doing something where you're like, here's control of the program. You take it. All right. And when the program's over, I'm going to take it back. No, give them control. Let them curate. And our museum did a great job with that, with the Pieces of Now exhibit that won 5 awards, including 2 international awards. But it was truly curated by the community. And so museums are trying very hard to change this narrative and to be more inclusive and bring people and tell stories. And like my boss always says, she's the one that gave me the phrase, if you walk into a museum and you're smiling when you leave every time, we didn't do our job. And no, we got to be partial. And I have a hard time with that, but we just want to be a place where you come to the table and you talk. You may disagree with everything I just said, but tell me your story. You know what I'm saying? And allow me to tell you mine. And then let's just talk.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. And talking is what we like to do here, Old School Sunday Conversations. I think you've given us something to think about, something for us to continue talking about. We have to be deliberate, I think, with engaging, as you've mentioned, and not being student-centered, teacher-centered, but learning-centered. Let's learn what these histories have been. Let's be honest about it, and let's walk in those truths that we find. And again, I think there's an opportunity for us to grow from that learning, grow from learning from each other. And Mr. Hudson is going to keep the prayer up every Old School Sunday, praying everybody have a great one, and praying that what you said, that money don't lead to a lot of the bad decisions that get made by people, some of the evil that get invited in by loving the money and not using money for what it is as a tool.
Yeah, exactly. And money's not bad. It's the love of it, Right. And
right.
Let me sneak this in before you close out. Always give students or people you're around a sense of belonging. I used to always tell my kids, what does your name mean? If they didn't know what their name meant, I made them come back and tell me. And if you're a white female or a white young male, tell me what your name means. What's your heritage? Be proud of who you are. If you're Hispanic, tell me what your name means. Where are your people from originally? Trace it back. Tell me something. African American, tell me who you are. I want to honor who you are. So you need to know who you are. Don't walk around saying, my name Michael. Find out who you are,
Right. I like that.
Give people belong. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Hey, we'll definitely close it on that note. Again, I know I'm going to have to go back and watch this and go down a few of those rabbit holes that you left open for the audience, and the breadcrumbs that you dropped in here. And I'm hoping that, again, we can be reflective as we're watching this, using our memory, finding out more about our history. What are we purposely trying to ignore or not look at? And I think the opportunity to learn more, as you said, about yourself and learn more about your surroundings is a lot of times right there in front of us, with conversations that we can have with elders, and also being willing to search out that information and to learn more. So I'm hoping that's what happens within this Old School Sunday conversation that we had, Brother Rodney, and I appreciate your time, and I thank you, brother, again.
Thank you, brother, man. I always love, man. Appreciate you reaching out to me.
Yes, sir. We'll wrap soon, I'm sure.